Thank you very much. Taking page from Richard's very interesting and juicy title of his presentation, I scrapped my old title and then decided to have a new one. It's called China Model, Taiwan Model, or maybe a Qinwen Model. Somebody began to use that cliche again. Okay. It's a great pleasure for me to come to Taipei, actually for third time. This is my third time in 10 years. My last visit about 5-6 years ago. And as someone who was born in mainland China and spent a lot of time there growing up, and Taiwan has always occupied a very special place in my heart. And unlike my poor colleagues who had to suffer jet lag, I flew from Beijing. And I have to say, my observation of Taiwan for my third visit began when I embarked on that flight. Even before that, because I went to the check at the capital airport, I check in and said only one seat left in the middle. I said, are you kidding? That's only another 2 hours. There was so basically full flight. Indeed, it was a very full flight. And it's early morning and arrived before lunch. And that's how short the trip was. And that's first impression I had is a plane full of people. Many of them are tourists from mainland, and how short the flight is. Of course, even with that little cross eastward of Shanghai, I still feel that's quite amazing. Now, yesterday we visited Taipei 101. Watching those, many of them, we saw that many of the visitors were mainland Chinese. I can hear from the behavior and the talk. And watching them, I couldn't help to think if they share my first two small impressions of Taiwan this time. Number one, when I check into this hotel, I asked the front desk, can I have a non-smoking room? And I was told, to my big surprise as a New Yorker and someone living in Beijing for the last 2 years, that, we don't have any non-smoking rooms. Everything is non-smoking now inside. I said, really? In hotels? No, is it all inside the building? All prohibited, now smoking is prohibited. I was so impressed. That's number one. I thought if mainland Chinese look at this, Yunhan talked about soft power, and that's, I think, is a quite interesting aspect of the soft power that Taiwan could show mainland Chinese visitors that how Taiwan has evolved. The second impression I had was yesterday I went to actually a couple of bookstores in Taipei. Actually, quite a few. Some in the shopping mall, some small ones near Taida NTU, and every shop I went, a bookstores, and I have not seen anything a fake, copy or a knockoff copy. That's so impressive to me, who live near Tsinghua University, near Wudao. Some of you might visit that area. There are a lot of those copied books that sells for 15 kwai. The American popular, popular books on bestseller. It's so cheap. I have to be guilty of buying some of those and reading here in Beijing. There in Beijing. So that's another impression I had, and that's so because it's not a small thing that to tell people that. You see, things can be changed. I believe that someone told me that in 1960s, 70s, Taiwan, there's also a problem like that. But things can change. And that's what I think why this brings to my topic today is about the how, why, and why we should, again, rekindle the concept of Taiwan model. We almost forget it after 20 years or 30 years of Chinese reform, because in the beginning of the Chinese reform, everybody talked about the Taiwan model. All right, but then there's some recent issue, some recent event that brought that up again, I think rightly so. And this is what I want to talk about, discuss with you today. The recent event I mentioned is the event at Shenzhen. Some of you already know about this 12 suicide cases in less than 8 months at the facility of the Foxconn, belongs to the Honghai group here in Taiwan. And it attracted, of course, media attention on both sides of the streets. Actually, world media also picked it up. And the story itself, in the beginning, seems to be simple. It's just, in the beginning, it's just young migrant workers of, in their 20s committed suicide. But then as it goes along, every month you hear one or two. And Chinese media began to count as number 10, number 12, number 11, number 12. So it becomes, kind of a serious matter and become a media sensation. In fact, if you look, I actually look at the Chinese media and the Taiwanese media, I noticed that there's already some discussion, serious discussion among scholars on this side of the streets about whether the so-called China model, they call it China model, is began to change. It's very interesting. In fact, some of the writers are Columbian PhDs, I have to say, which are their names interesting, and quite a few of them have either organized a seminar on this or have written about this. And I think generally there are two major agreements that I see this from the critique of the so-called China model. One is that they are critical of the China model and the participation of Taiwan business in producing and perpetuating this called a low-cost, cutthroat, low, sort of a labor-intensive model of development, and the kind of negative impact on the economy and on Chinese society. And the second agreement I detect from this critiques that written by some of the Taiwanese scholar here is that they also believe that such model is about to change, and with some implication that Taiwan businesses may have to rethink their strategy in the mainland because this now of course, as we know, that Foxconn Honghai has agreed to raise wages as much as 120%, and of course in a few days that the Chinese government's formal report investigation will come out, which I believe will not completely fault the owner or the Foxconn, and probably going to downplay it from there on. But there's another also implication in their discussion, which is unsaid, which I think I can detect also, which is interesting, which is related to my discussion today, that is the political implication. As we all know, Taiwan has, that's why I call it Taiwan model. Indeed, it may be not a China model per se, right? A low labor-intensive, export-oriented industry, right? Low cost, government-led. All this sounds very familiar with Taiwan development. And I see, of course, among my colleagues here, presenters here, I see Dennis Simon, Richard Bush, Professor Zhu, and Professor Zhang all have written about this Taiwan development early on. But I think China is probably at that critical turning point, facing a kind of a change in the quote Taiwan model or China model. In terms of economic development. Then, of course, what happened in Taiwan also, if you look at broadly, that Taiwan, the end of the export labor-intensive model coincided with the end of authoritarianism. So the political implication is very interesting for China. Are we seeing, if, of course, the two sets of questions here raised. One, the first set of questions is if and when this labor-intensive, export-oriented, low-cost, cutthroat model is over, right? If it is over, and then what are the political implications? That probably won't have time to discuss, but that's very interesting. The second one, which I will probably focus on a little more, is whether and how Taiwan businesses can benefit and contribute to this process of ending the old model and begin a new one, if we're going to see one. So, first of all, let me say that I agree in general with the critics of the so-called China model or Taiwan model that the labor-intensive, low-cost, export-oriented economic development model is not sustainable. It will have to change. And I also agree that this model is not uniquely PRC. As I already mentioned, that probably all these so-called four dragons of East Asia have at some point, one point or another, experienced same kind of development path. So if Taiwan's path to give any indication that probably mainland China going to face the same kind of experience, we don't know now. Maybe it's just sometime down the road. But obviously, it's going to have to be changed. It also, no doubt, that the mainland Chinese economic development has reached a key turning point with a larger transition. That is, labor costs are on the rise. Export sector is squeezed often by the economic demand or the world market demand, as we saw in the past few years during the couple of years during the crisis, and the social demands are on the rise too. And in fact, along with the Honda plant strike in elsewhere in China, there is already began a talk, and not only talk, you can see the policy switch ever so softly and inexplicitly that the Chinese government allow union to play a major role in collective bargaining. Even collective bargaining already been written into labor law some years ago. In reality, collective bargaining never was a very wide practice. Now, with this recent spike of labor unrest, one could presume that labor unions' role would begin to be increased. So that is another interesting, probably similar phenomenon with the other earlier developers like Taiwan, South Korea, and probably to some extent Latin America. And government itself that mainland Chinese government find increasingly hard to suppress these demands, social demands and so on. And it makes more, it probably also now, the government also requires more environmental impact consideration of investment. So all this restriction, again, very similar to the past experience of Taiwan, that this probably could bring some sort of political change. And as well discussed that even though I don't think it is imminent, but in a longer framework, not longer a medium term, as what Professor Zhu already pointed out, 10 to 15 years, this may indeed, even from a political economy point of view, he talked about other, sort of cross-strait the kind of a regional point of view. Even from a political economy point of view, the China's change probably going to take place in that era, that frame of time. So that's a interesting point to bear in mind. So the low-cost, export-oriented processing industry will face increasingly, no doubt, difficulties without change. In fact, prior to this recent labor unrest in Guangdong, there were already periods of what is called labor shortage in the Pearl River Delta, and Guangdong provincial government before the crisis took place actually had decided consciously that they're going to change the development model. They want to squeeze out labor-intensive industries and admit more high-tech, more innovative industries. But because the crisis, they actually didn't implement it and delayed it for now. Now, this, I think, the leadership has the conscious decision to, in the long term, to switch, to change, transform the earlier economic development model. And I think personally, as someone who studies Chinese politics and political economy, I think the Honghai incident or the Foxconn incident couldn't come earlier. The incident, in sense, of course, is very, very heavy. There's very heavy costs, but this kind of the sort of new capital-labor relations, if this can sustain, I think would probably benefit China's overall development in the long run. But I think it's also, let me say that, but I believe it is too early to ring the death bell of the old model. And this here, the so-called China model is probably differs somewhat from Taiwan model. Well, we know, or the so-called the four little dragon model, because there's some quite interesting and obvious difference between mainland China and that of Taiwan and Korea and Japan. First of all, the large population. You have to bring that into consideration. I say this not because somehow the population would the population growth or the large population somehow would absorb the low wages, but also because another aspect, and that is the gap between rich and poor, the sort of class gap. In the Taiwan model, when Taiwan developed, the gap between the rich and poor is relatively small. So some say that today's China actually recalls Latin America more than Taiwan. And that, I think, is because China has a very large poor population. So one has to be struck by how many people that Honghai, the Foxconn employed. I actually didn't know that it had almost 700,000 employees in China, and half of them are in Shenzhen alone. Imagine the kind of incentive for Shenzhen government to somehow let the Honghai stay. right? Even though there are already signs that Honghai is talking about moving to interior. So that brought my second point, that is China also has a large regional differences. Even though in the last 3 decades, this regional differences have somewhat, closed a little bit. But still, coastal province has a huge difference in terms of income gaps and so on, and also the kind of development model. There's still a difference between the two sides. So basically, the businesses could move inland rather than move outside of China. So I already see signs of my time coming up. So finally, I think there's another difference. Is unlike Taiwan and other export-oriented economies, mainland China has a large domestic market. So the domestic consumption could absorb the large sort of the loss of the export-oriented economy. So in that sense, the China model could probably develop somewhat differently than that of Taiwan. So in a sense, I also would say that in the immediate terms, I don't think the so-called labor-intensive export-oriented industry would die out. Yeah, I think probably the strategy for the Taiwanese investors would probably be that of so-called 两个转变. One is to 转进, sort of instead of moving out, they move inland, 转进. So there's that kind of a transfer of industry into interior land and taking part in the interior development. That is, for example, places like Chongqing, Anhui, Hubei, and so on. The second one is, of course, 转型. Sort of the kind of from changing the model of development, changing model of the industry from that of low cost, labor intensive to that technology intensive and higher valued added products. And also one could point out that in fact between 1991 and 2005, Taiwanese investment in service industry only took up about 4%, less than 4%. Until last year, it's about 15%. It's still small, but it's growing. It's still small. So in that sense, that of course, service industry is something that the Taiwanese investment could probably go in. Now, let me end by saying that, of course, that it's a time we begin to rekindle this consideration of what Taiwan model, what Taiwan experience would tell us down the road. Because Chinese, as I said, Chinese development is at a critical point. I think in the next 10 years, we're probably going to see in terms of economic structure, a kind of gradual change in from that of a labor-intensive, export-oriented to a technology-intensive and domestic consumption-based economy, and that would take time, but definitely want to happen. So with that, let me end here, and thank you very much. Thank you.